welcome to this week's edition of a World Panorama. I'm Aishwarya Kapoor with you, and in the next 30 minutes we'll be getting you a complete roundup of all the major international news events that unfolded this week. Let us start the program with the headlines. Hong Kong marks anniversary of Chinese rule with protests. Demonstrators are smashed into legislature building, face off with the police. China tells the UK to stop interfering after British Foreign Secretary criticizes what he calls are terrible scenes in Hong Kong. Trump becomes first sitting US president to set foot in North Korea, meets Kim Jong-un in the demilitarized zone between the two Koreas. Leaders agree to resume stalled nuclear talks. Libya considers closing all migrant detention centers after more than 50 people die as airstrike hits a detention center in Tripoli. UN agencies say the attack may constitute a war crime. Hopes for democracy in Sudan as power-sharing deal reached by military and civilian leaders. Deal ends a standoff that has paralyzed the country since the ouster of President Omar al-Bashir in April. And Japan resumes commercial whaling after more than 30 years, officially leaves the International Whaling Commission, which regulates whaling globally. Outrage from activists over the practice and whale numbers. Top story is from Hong Kong, where police have arrested 12 people for the 1st of July anti-government protests that led to the storming and vandalizing of the city's parliament. It was on the day marking the 22nd anniversary of the former British colony's return to Chinese rule on Monday that hundreds of demonstrators smashed their way into the Legislative Council. While Beijing intensified its condemnation of the protests, tensions have also risen between Beijing and UK, with China accusing the UK of interfering in the internal affairs of Hong Kong and supporting violent lawbreakers. Now, this after British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt said that he had witnessed terrible scenes in Hong Kong. It was the anniversary of Hong Kong's handover from British to Chinese rule in 1997. The day usually marked by an annual pro-democracy march. But this year, things took a violent turn. In the early morning, protesters blocked streets around the venue where Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam was attending the annual flag-raising ceremony. Then, at around midday, dozens of demonstrators broke off from the main protest and made their way to the government headquarters. Protesters smashed through its glass doors and stormed the building. Activists occupying the Legislative Council for hours. They defaced the emblem of Hong Kong in the central chamber inside, raised the old British colonial flag, spray-painted messages across the walls and shattered furniture. Ultimately, police had to fire tear gas to clear the Legislative Council.
My absolute top concern is the safety of Hong Kong people, because it is a very critical moment. And if the government chooses not to try and solve this political problem and chooses to use police or even Beijing to deal with Hong Kong people, then we may be facing the tragedy of 20 years of handover.
Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam condemned the violence and pledged to take necessary legal action. She stressed the importance of maintaining the rule of law in Hong Kong.
The second scene that we have seen, which really saddens a lot of people and shocks a lot of people, is the extreme use of violence and vandalism by protesters who stormed into the Legislative Council building over a period of time. So this is something that we should seriously condemn.
The unrest come even as Hong Kong has been witnessing protests since May due to a controversial extradition bill. Many Hong Kongers see the bill as eroding special freedoms afforded to them under the one country, two systems model, a model which was created during Hong Kong's handover from British to Chinese rule in 1997. The city maintains distinct and independent rule of law to China as part of that framework. Due to the widespread outcry over the bill, the government suspended the extradition bill last month and it is now unlikely to pass. But the protesters want it scrapped completely and are calling on Lam to stand down. The protests have broadened to include the release of all detained activists and investigations into alleged police violence, as well as general concerns over Beijing's influence eroding the territory's rule of law and special rights. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV. Donald Trump became the first sitting US president to set foot in North Korea on Sunday when he met its leader Kim Jong-un in the demilitarized zone between the two Koreas and agreed to resume stalled nuclear talks. The meeting, initiated by a spur-of-the-moment tweet by Trump that Kim said took him by surprise, once again displayed the rapport between the two leaders. But Trump and Kim are no closer to narrowing the gap between their positions since they walked away from their summit in February in Vietnam. In fact, just 3 days after the historic meet in DMZ, North Korea accused the US of being hell-bent on hostile acts despite their agreement to resume nuclear talks. A historic handshake and wide grins were captured as US President Donald Trump and North Korea's Kim Jong-un met at the heavily fortified demilitarized zone on Sunday. The border encounter was a made-for-television moment. The men strode toward one another from opposite sides of the joint security area and shook hands at the military demarcation line. After asking if Kim wanted him to cross, Trump took 10 steps into the north, with Kim at his side, then escorted Kim back to the south for talks at Freedom House, where the two leaders agreed to revive talks on Pyongyang's nuclear program. Trump became the first sitting US president to set foot in North Korea.
But I asked him, I said, would you like me to come across the line? He said, I would be honored to do that. I would be honored. Now, I didn't know really what he was going to say. But it was my honor to do it. We had a very good meeting.
It was intended to be an impromptu exchange of pleasantries, but it turned into a 50-minute meeting. It all started with a tweet. Trump was scheduled to hold talks about the stalled North Korea nuclear negotiations with South Korean President Moon Jae-in and to visit the demilitarized zone, the buffer area between the two Koreas since the end of the Korean War. Donald Trump tweeted a message to Kim, suggested he could meet him at the border just to shake his hand and say hello. After a day of backroom diplomacy, Trump and Moon confirmed on Sunday that Kim had accepted the invitation and that there would be a brief handshake. That turned into an almost hour-long meeting and marked the return to face-to-face contact between the leaders after their talks broke down during a summit in Vietnam in February.
I can only say the meeting was a very good one, very strong, very solid, great relationship, and we'll see what can happen. Now we'll just see if we can do something. But again, we want to get it right. We're not looking for speed. We're looking to get it right. And in the meantime, there's been no nuclear tests. There's been no ballistic missiles. There's been a lot of goodwill.
Negotiations with North Korea to try to convince it to abandon its nuclear program reached a peak last year when Trump and Kim had a historic meeting in Singapore. They both committed to the complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, but without clarifying what that meant. It was hoped that their second meeting in Vietnam in February would make some concrete agreement about North Korea handing over its nuclear program in exchange for some of the sanctions against it being lifted. But those talks ended with no deal, as Trump and Kim failed to agree on the pace at which sanctions should be eased. While significant doubts still remain about the future of the negotiations and the North's willingness to give up its stockpile of nuclear weapons, both US and North Korea feel the talks are back on track. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV. Libya's government is considering closing all migrant detention centers. This after an airstrike hit a detention center for mainly African migrants in the suburb of the capital Tripoli on Tuesday. The UN recognized the Libyan government has accused the forces led by General Haftar of mounting the air raid. Haftar launched a military assault on the capital on 4th of April in an effort to oust the Libyan government. The EU, UN agencies, Britain and Italy are leading calls for an investigation into the attack that might eventually lead to war crime charges. The UN even says that it has received reports that guards fired on the migrants who were trying to flee the airstrikes. United Nations Security Council met on Wednesday after an airstrike hit Libya migrant detention center in capital Tripoli on Tuesday, killing at least 53 people and wounding more than 130. Women and children were among the victims. Most of the dead are believed to be sub-Saharan African migrants.
There were refugees and migrants, and we all condemn that.
It was the highest publicly reported toll from an airstrike or shelling since forces under Khalifa Haftar launched a ground and aerial offensive 3 months ago to take Tripoli, the base of Libya's internationally recognized government. UN officials say the attack could constitute a war crime. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for an independent investigation of the outrageous bombing, while Libyan government blamed the airstrike on forces loyal to General Khalifa Haftar. Haftar's forces accused the government side of shelling.
Ministry of Interior denounces the horrible crime that has been committed against the Liva detention center for illegal migrants in Tajawra that took place by Haftar's criminal aircrafts. This is a defined crime in every aspect, which has led to humanitarian tragedy.
It is noteworthy that Libya is one of the main departure points for African migrants fleeing poverty and war to try to reach Italy by boat. But many are picked up and brought back by the Libyan Coast Guard, and they stay in Libya. Some 6,000 are held in government-run detention centers in Libya. However, renewed fighting in and around Tripoli has put migrants held in detention camps directly in the line of fire. United Nations says the location of the migrant center that was attacked and the information that it housed civilians had been passed to all parties, and yet the attack took place.
That both sides have the coordinates of these detention centres. Both sides are aware where these detention centres are located and that there are people inside those detention centres at the time being. So what needs to happen now is a full and thorough investigation. Those found to be responsible need to be held to account.
Libya has been torn by violence and division since long-time ruler Muammar Gaddafi was deposed and killed in 2011. No authority has full control over Libya, and the country is torn between several political and military factions, the two most important of which are led by Prime Minister Faiz al-Sarraj, that leads UN-backed government, and General Haftar. Haftar has built up a power base in the east and has won some support from France, Egypt and the UAE. He started an offensive against the government in April and is looking to take capital Tripoli. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV. Sudan's military leaders have reached an agreement with the opposition alliance to share power until elections can be held. The two sides agreed to rotate control of the Sovereign Council, the top tier of power, for at least 3 years. They have also pledged to form an independent technocratic government and to investigate the violence of recent weeks. The talks came after a weeks-long standoff after negotiations collapsed when security forces violently broke up a protesters' sit-in in the capital Khartoum. Now, news of an agreement sparked frenzied street celebrations. Remember, Sudan has been in turmoil since the military ousted President Omar al-Bashir in April.
Sudan's military rulers and opposition alliance sitting face to face in Khartoum to decide on the future of the country over who should lead Sudan towards elections. After the marathon two-day meeting, the two sides finally reached an agreement to share power during a transition period leading to elections. It was agreed that a sovereign council will be created with a rotating military and civilian presidency for a period of 3 years. Elections will then be held once its transition period ends. The development sets off street celebrations by thousands of people.
The two sides have agreed on establishing a sovereign council by rotation between the military and civilians for a period of 3 years or slightly more. Both sides also agreed upon postponing the establishment of legislative council until the sovereign council and civilian government is in order.
The restarting of talks broke weeks of political impasse since the military ousted autocratic President Omar al-Bashir in April. Since then, protests took place demanding a civilian-run democratic rule. This was followed by talks between the military and political opposition for a power-sharing agreement. However, talks collapsed when the security forces violently broke up protest camp in Khartoum on June 3rd. Opposition-linked medics have said 118 people were killed in the crackdown, while military council put the toll at 61. Since then, mediators led by the AU and Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed have been trying to broker a return to direct talks between the two sides.
We thank the African and Ethiopian mediators for their efforts and patience. We reassure all that this agreement will be comprehensive and will not exclude anyone and will also reach up to the ambitions of the Sudanese people.
The military removed former President Omar al-Bashir in April amid mass protest against his rule. Protesters, however, remained in the streets fearing the general's intent to cling to power or preserve some form of authoritarian rule. However, with an agreement between military and political opposition, finally Sudan hopes this is the beginning of a new era ushering in democratic rule. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
And here is a look at some more international news in Global Buzz. Australian Alec Singley, who went missing in North Korea last week, is released and safe. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison confirmed on Friday. Now, this comes after a meeting between officials from the Swedish embassy in Pyongyang and the North Korean government. Australia does not have its own embassy in the North Korean capital. Singley was pursuing a master's degree and running a tourism business in Pyongyang. It is not known why the student had been detained. Boeing is giving $100 million to help families affected by the two crashes of the company's 737 MAX planes in Indonesia and Ethiopia. The payment, stretching over several years, is independent of the lawsuits filed in the wake of the disasters, which together killed 346 people. The loss of Ethiopian Airlines flight ET-302 in March was the second fatal accident involving a 737 MAX in the space of 5 months. A near-identical aircraft owned by the Indonesian carrier Lion Air went down in the Sea of Jakarta in October 2018. The top-selling 737 MAX has been grounded worldwide since March. And more than 1 million people across the Japanese island of Kyushu were ordered to evacuate amid warnings of landslides and floods brought on by heavy rains. The authorities urged residents in parts of Kagoshima and Miyazaki prefectures to move to safety immediately. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe told residents of the cities to take steps to protect their lives. Kagoshima Prefecture has asked Japan's self-defense forces to help with the relief efforts. Weather officials say that 1,000 mm of rain has fallen on Kyushu Island since Friday, and Japan's Met Agency forecasts that the rains will continue into next week. On 1st of July, to the fury of conservationists around the world, Japan officially resumed commercial whaling after 31 years. This as Japan ended its membership of the International Whaling Commission, or the IWC. IWC had in 1986 announced a ban on commercial whaling to protect the world's last remaining whales, though it allowed Japan an annual whale quota for scientific reasons. But now, after opting out of the IWC, Japanese whalers can now hunt for minke, bides and sea whales, all of which are protected by the IWC and are at the risk of endangerment. On the first day of Japan's return to commercial whaling, 2 whales were killed and brought back to the port. A whaling ship that sailed out of harbour in Kushiro on Monday morning returned late afternoon with its first caught minke whale, one of the 2 whales that were caught on Monday. This comes as Japan resumed commercial whaling following a pause of more than 30 years. The whale was loaded on a truck from the boat and transported to a factory for butchering. Japan announced in December that it was leaving the International Whaling Commission to resume hunting.
The resumption of commercial whaling has been the strong wish of not only the people of Kushiro, but all those in the Japanese whaling industry. I am happy from the bottom of my heart.
Conservationists have slammed Japan for withdrawing from the IWC and resuming the commercial hunts, which they view as inhumane and outdated. But Japan contends that practice is a long-standing tradition that should not be subject to outside interference. Japan's fisheries agencies has set a quota for commercial whale hunting through December of 227 whales, 52 minke whales, 150 brides whales and 25 sei whales.
We want to continue whaling in the future in a sustainable manner. The quota that has been released is something that would not affect resources for 100 years. So, we'll follow the quota and continue to hunt.
The whales were brought to the brink of extinction by hunting in the 19th and early 20th century. In 1986, all members of the International Whaling Commission agreed to a hunting moratorium to allow whale numbers to recover. However, whaling countries like Japan, Norway and Iceland used a loophole in the moratorium to continue hunting. The moratorium allowed indigenous groups to carry out subsistence whaling and also allowed whaling for scientific purposes. Under the cover of whaling for scientific purposes, Japan continued to hunt whales for food. Meat from the whales killed for research ending up for sale. And now the country has formally withdrawn from the International Whaling Commission that has led to global condemnation and fears for the fate of whales. Besides the question of stock sustainability, a key argument against the hunt is that harpooning whales leads to a slow and painful death. But Japan has defied the criticism and is sticking with its whaling plans. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV. And that's it in today's episode. But before we go, take a look at this donkey festival that was held in the Colombian town of Muniqueras on Sunday, where donkeys dress up and people win prizes for braying. Yes, the donkeys paraded through the streets of the town wearing costumes. People, meanwhile, put their lungs to test by trying to see who could best imitate a donkey's bray. The festival is meant to honor the rural farmers of the region who rely on donkeys for their daily work in the fields. So take a look at these visuals as I take your leave. I'll see you next week in another edition of World Panorama. Bye-bye.